Had an interesting conversation a few minutes ago with an anthropology teacher here, and we had a talk about, particularly he was interested in learning why some cultures and some civilizations have advanced and others haven't. In chapter 17, we're talking about, well, three groups of people: the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans. But we'll spend most of the time talking about China. The Chinese were the race of people. Now, oops, use that term race. It's a bad term. There's only one race which we're talking about, and that's the human race. The Chinese were the group of people who almost came the closest to bursting out of their seams and overspreading the globe. But they didn't. They came the closest to becoming the technological innovators of all the peoples of the earth. By the year 1500, they had invented more things than anyone else. I won't be able to list all of them, but what all had they invented? They had invented the banking system, paper money, gunpowder, the movable rudder. There was a rudder that turned a ship. The movable sail, where your sails didn't have to remain rigid but could move, and anyone who knows anything about sailboating knows how great that is. The wheelbarrow, they invented silk, steel, porcelain, the printing press, a very, very important invention. I mean, I'm not asking you to memorize all those. Like I say, I once saw a list of the Chinese inventions, and it's quite impressive. These inventions should have propelled them to the top economically, politically. They almost did. But along the way, they would stumble. Some philosopher would come along and say, paper money leads to greed, and we don't want greed in this country. And they eliminate your paper money. Banking leads to indebtedness, and we can't have a whole lot of indebtedness. Indebtedness is evil. I mean, hey, I know some of this, folk, there's some merit to it, it's true. So they would throw out their banking system. Gunpowder, they invented it, but did not really make effective use of it. The Mongolians made better weapons with gunpowder than they did. Then along came the Muslims, we talked about last chapter, and they made even better weapons. Chinese are known to have had extremely large wooden sailing vessels, larger than anything Europeans had until the 1800s, mid-1700s at least. And these sailing vessels are known to have sailed all the way to California. But they stopped going to California. But they came to the New World before Columbus. Now, granted, it is 2.5 times farther from China to California than the Europeans had to travel to get across the Atlantic, going from Spain and France and England to the eastern part of North America. I mean, for the Spanish, it was a 4,000, 5,000 mile trip. For the English, it was about a 4,000 mile trip. For the Chinese, it was a 10 to 11,000 mile trip. Quite a bit longer, but basically they quit going. Their ships are known to have gone at one point to Africa and even brought back giraffes for their zoo that the emperor was very impressed with, but eventually those ships stopped traveling and only went to India. It is believed at one point they actually overspread the whole globe and mapped the whole world, but then they did not show any interest in the rest of the world. Nor they would get so far and then quit. Now, we find China at the beginning of the chapter at what we call the apex of its power. That's a term your book uses. China at its top. And about this time, I'm talking about the year 1500 now. China was at the apex of its power, and they believed themselves to be better than anyone else. The Portuguese led the way. Yes, some Portuguese sailors landed in China just like they first landed in India. And by the time the Portuguese had gone all the way around Africa, all the way across the Indian Ocean, all the way across the East Indies Islands, and landed in China, they were dirty, ragged, infested with lice and scurvy and all this stuff, and they didn't make any impression on the Chinese, whatever. The Chinese remained convinced we're better than they are. But these Portuguese went back home to Portugal and came back with an even larger fleet and even more ships. And the Chinese began to think, yeah, we're better than they are. Well, if they were better, how come they weren't the ones going to Portugal instead of the Portuguese coming to them? Anyway, this was the first contacts that China had had with the West, practically the first since Marco Polo. The Ming Dynasty collapsed, and a new dynasty came over, the Qing. Now, the word dynasty, it means they rule from generation to generation, father to son, usually father to son, or if the father has no sons, maybe from father to nephew, but basically it's a rule by a family, where the throne passes down to generations. And China tells its history, or its history revolves around their dynasties. There was a period of the dynasty way back yonder called the Han Dynasty, and another period of time called the Song Dynasty. But these dynasties would start off with a great, strong ruler and last for a few generations, some longer than others. The Han Dynasty lasted 900 years. I mean, that's a really long time for a dynasty. But they'd last for a few generations, then they'd get corrupt, weak. Another dynasty would come in, swoop, and remove the first dynasty, and they would start the same pattern all over again. Start out with a couple of capable rulers, and then become corrupt and weak. And but anyway, the Ming fell, and they were replaced by the Qing, spelled Q-I-N-G. One of the few times you'll see a Q without a U. Q, and that's pronounced Qing, as best as I understand it, at least. Qing Dynasty was one of the great dynasties. Again, the Chinese rate their dynasties on how much they conquered, how well things prospered while this dynasty was in power. Anyway, the Qing Dynasty was supposedly one of their great ones, but they again got so far and faltered. Now, we used to think in the West that Chinese history was a history of stagnation, that they just kept the sameness generation in and generation out. Back in 1986, maybe before a lot of your time, I developed a liking for Chinese restaurants, and I still visit them. But they used to play this music that seemed to go on and on and on and on, never had a beginning. It was playing when you came in, and the same music was playing when you left. On and never a beginning, never an end, just on and on and on. I got the impression this is their history. They just viewed the world as just going on and on and on, never any change, never beginning end. But now we know this is not exactly true. They did have a few changes from time to time. And a big debate is why was it not the Chinese that overspread the globe, why it was not them, and we'll be talking more about that as the lesson progresses. Anyway, the book goes into some detail about about the couple of rulers. Don't worry about their names. Again, I promise you the names of these rulers will not be on the test. And the name of Kang Zi, I'm not sure how that's pronounced.